Okay, guys, today's video is going to be a bit long with me rambling on. I was at the Fuji rumor site and there was this article, Top 10 Critiques on Fujifilm. And there's a lot of Fuji fanboyism going on here. And I was planning to prepare my own 10 list. I think I call it the 10 Dark Truths of Fujifilm. So let me talk about these and then I'm going to give you my 10. So let's get into it. The first one, it's not full frame. Part 1, GFX. They talk about the GFX not being a true medium format sensor. I don't follow the medium format, the Fujifilm GFX line too much. Great cameras. I think it's awesome what Fujifilm is doing, getting into that medium frame market at a low price point. I think it's a good thing. It gets a lot of criticisms because it's not the full medium format. I forget all the size differences. It's a little smaller, but still, it's an awesome thing. It's an awesome thing not only for Fujifilm, it's an awesome thing for all of us camera enthusiasts. It brings that price point, if you've been wanting to get medium format, down to a reasonable, like $2,000-$3,000 reasonable price range. But he goes on to say how it gets a lot of critique, and it does, and I think it's a little bit, I kind of agree with him a little bit, but whatever. Moving on. It's not full frame. Part 2 talks about the APS-C, and I like Fujifilm, and I'm going to talk about this more in detail on my 10, but it's not. He talks about, it's the best. You don't always need the best dynamic range, but here's where he goes into Fuji fanboyism. That's true, and these cameras like the Fuji X-T2, the X3, X4, they take pictures as good as maybe 3 old generation full frame cameras, but they don't hold in that same competition with the new modern full frame backside illuminated full frame sensors. So this is where it's starting to Fuji fanboyism big time, because although these are great cameras, they do get the job done. They just are not in the same league as the bigger sensor, one for one. If you're comparing it with an A7 III, something like that, it's not going to compete. Will it do the job? Yes. Will the other one do better? Yes. 3, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on all of these. Full frame pricing is the same as APS-C, and it says, basically there are full frame cameras out there cost as much as APS-C. What this is, he's saying that people critique them because you can buy a Canon RP for $999, and although it's $1,000, it's not in the same ballpark as far as picture quality, dynamic range, and so on as the Fujifilm X-T4 that sells for right about $1,600, I believe, maybe $1,700, I forget. And that's true, but who's comparing the RP to an X-T4? I think most people compare an A7 III, which is within $100, to the X-T4. So this, again, Fuji fanboyism. I think, and we'll talk about the cost again more in detail. I'm not going to get all these details here. Number 4, complain about things Fujifilm GFX shooters don't care that much about. So goes and talks about the burst rate, and I don't think this is a big deal. I don't see a whole lot of people writing. It's more of a medium format thing rather than a GFX thing. I think anybody that's in a medium format is happy, overly pleased with the performance that the GFX provides, because historically, if you had a medium format camera, there was no such thing as fast focus or burst rate. It was create your shot, take your time, take a photo. So I don't think anybody that's even considering medium format has this opinion. Now, this opinion, I think, comes up when you compare a GFX to a Sony A7 III, a full frame camera, or a A7R, and so on, and it doesn't compete. But that is not why you buy a GFX. So I think when people start comparing it because of the price range, but used for totally different things. The GFX is slow, portraiture type of things, until that autofocus and burst rate gets there. Maybe it does, but again, people aren't buying a medium format camera to do wildlife in sports. No, they don't. They're not doing that. Number five, getting facts wrong, making up definitions to ridicule the system. And he goes on and talks more about the GFX sensor stuff. And yeah, I'm not going to get into this one because it's kind of stupid. Number six, Kaizen is dead. He talks about, it's funny, he says Kaizen's not dead, but then he makes up reasons and excuses why they're not updating in any cameras. And yes, Kaizen is dead. That's not a myth. That's a truth. I'm going to cover that in my top 10. 7, the X-Trans sensor. This is the weird one for me because this guy is a Fuji guru supposedly, and I love this site. I go to this site all the time, and you guys know a lot of my videos are from this site. But what he talks about the X-Trans, and I'm no camera engineer, but I believe he actually talks about the green pixels incorrectly. I could be wrong. The X-Trans sensor, it's got a lot of pros and a lot of cons. I'm torn between it, and the reason being because I like how they omit the low pass filter to manage moire. A lot of camera manufacturers put a low pass filter. It degrades the image quality. With the Fujifilm XT series, the X-Trans cameras, it has that different color array, and I think I covered this a little bit more on one of my previous recent videos to combat that so they can omit the filter. Now, if you're talking a 24 megapixel sensor, you would get more array. For some reason, and again, I'm no engineer, when you get in the higher megapixel, like the Sony A7R series cameras, they don't have low pass filters. A lot of the Canon high-end cameras don't have low pass filters. And then I think the, what would it be, the 6D, not 6D, the R6, it has the sensor of their Pro sports camera. It's a 20 megapixel, and Canon figured out how to not use a low pass filter. So what it does basically gives you a sharper picture so that it can more compete on a full frame basis with a low pass filter, if that makes sense. So I like it in that regards. I like the sharpness of the Fuji and everything. Other people say it gives it that pop. I don't know. I think it does personally, but when I do a blind study myself, I can't really tell a difference. So moving on. Film simulations are useless in RAW shooters. He basically says that they're some people criticize them, that if you're shooting RAW, what's the point, right? And what he says is, no, it gives you a starting point, and I tend to agree with him. I don't think it gets much criticism, though. I think a lot of people enjoy Fujifilm and go to Fujifilm for two things. Three things. One is the look. Most of the Fujifilm cameras anyway look cool as hell. Two would be functionality. It's just very, very fun to use. And I lost my third one. Oh, and third would be these film simulations. A lot of guys were shooting back in the Chrome days of film. I never got into the different film lines, but I do love the film simulations. It's not gimmicky. I tend to use the standard or the Chrome settings. I also use the black and white. It's got awesome black and white. Sometimes I'll just put it in black and white and shoot all day. But I shoot RAW as well. So, you can convert in camera back to another JPEG using the film simulation, or you can use a profile if you shoot RAW. So that's one of the reasons I always shoot RAW. Second is I mess up once in a while. White balance might be jacked up. Exposure might be messed up, and I can help recover that a little bit more. So no, it's not. I don't think it gets criticism, to be honest with you. One or two, I wouldn't say it's a majority. I think most people like it. Fujifilm makes pessimistic, I'm not that smart, so statements. This is a misunderstood release. The Fuji CEO, Fuji focus on their medical care division, basically saying that they have no interest in photography anymore. I don't remember reading. I look at a lot of the forums and stuff, and I don't think that's true. I'm sure it's a decent segment to earn money. I mean, Canon's into it big time. I don't know about Nikon, but a lot of these cameras also go into the medical for their income, sensors in photography, medical equipment. I think the Fujifilm, the last one I remember reading, was about scopes to go up the bottom end if you're getting I forget what it's called, whatever that test is. Not a fun, pleasant 50-year-old test. So, yeah, I think most good camera companies do that. Why not? It makes good business sense. And it also advances sensor and other camera capabilities. I mean, yeah, you're not going to use it practice in that same practice, but we're talking low light. We're talking about other sharpness and things. I don't know why it would be a bad thing, but surely not to pull away from photography. I don't think any of the camera manufacturers want to do that. Well, most of the big ones. I know one or two might have done that, but I don't think Fujifilm is one of them. We want shallower depth of field than those f2 lenses. He talks about saying that APS-C just doesn't do it, the shallow depth of field. And he goes on to say that, there is the Fujinon 50mm f1 if you want that crazy shallow depth of field. Here's my take on it. These guys are right. It does not give you as shallow depth of field as a full frame. I think the bokeh, the out of focus areas are overdone. I don't like it. I like the separation. I like some bokeh and I like all that. I think the APS-C, especially on these f1.4 lenses and above, I know Fujifilm's got the f1.2 56mm, which I have, which is a great lens. More than enough for me, and I think for most people, unless you're really wanting to just kill all the background. That's not my preference, but if it is, the APS-C isn't probably your choice. If you like that, you want to shoot full frame 1.2, Fujifilm doesn't have anything like that. They also don't have anything on the zooms. If you look at the Fujifilm, what is it, the 70 to 140, 2.8, people will comment how small it is and how this and that compared to their 2.8 full frame. Guess what, folks? It's not comparison. It's more of a f4 comparison. If you take that same lens on the full frame sensor, you're gonna do what it would be 24 to 70 or 70 to 200. Yeah, 70 to 200 on a full frame would be an f4. So that, if you look comparable to that, the Fujifilm 2.8 to a full frame to f4, it's going to be like for like. So you're not saving anything. You're not saving any bokeh. So yeah, it's not like for like. And yeah, this guy is, again, Fujifilm fanboyism. If you need that shallow depth of field, another thing he doesn't talk about is low light. He might go into the bias. I'm not going to go the rest of the article. I'm going to switch over to mine, and we're going to cover some of this more. Again, I told you it's going to be rambling on, and I hope everybody stays, but I'm just giving you some warning. I don't want you to watch 20 minutes of this and say, he's just rambling on about nonsense. So here are my top 10, what do I call them, 10 dark truths of shooting Fujifilm cameras. And I want to start this off saying I love Fuji. Even if I get another camera line to try something out, I am not selling my Fuji. And I did another video. I'm planning to buy at least one more Fujifilm camera, X100V or whatever they come up with next, for sure, 100%. Gonna buy it. I kicking myself in the butt for not buying it last year. But with COVID and everything, I didn't know where things were going. And I'll also probably pick up the XT3 if it goes on a killer sale. And maybe an XT4. Again, depending on the sales. I'm not going to run out and buy, full retail for some of these cameras. But if there's a good deal, I'm going to pick it up. And I'm not selling my lenses either. As you can see, and the reason I have these on here, not to brag or anything, I just want to show you. I'm going to read through my top 10 dark truths. I'm pretty invested in Fujifilm. I have 3 flashes, which they're not real expensive flashes, but I love the Gotox flashpoint stuff. I got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lenses. So I'm pretty invested, and I've been shooting since the XT2 was new, about 4.5 years, something like that. So I have some time in here. So starting off, number 1, mobile app is not great. And that's putting it nicely. It actually sucks. The connection problems, not the greatest. If you're transferring like one picture from your camera to your phone, it usually works. If you want to do multiples, it usually crashes. If you're doing video, you might want to set up as a remote trigger. You could only record 720 even though the camera does 4K. It's just, come on, Fuji, kick it up a little bit. There is talk that they're gonna do some work on the mobile app. I hope so, but up to this date, it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, not a lot of love. So yeah, not great, not huge for most people, but not great. And I did these in kind of order to the less to the most, but it's not 100%. I didn't put much thought into this as far as the order goes. Number 2, Kaizen firmware improvements have slowed greatly. Yeah, Kaizen is pretty much dead. The other person over at the Fuji rumor site said that, talked about they still released updates. Those are updates. That is not Kaizen. Kaizen is giving you a crazy amount of stuff, not an update. When Canon provides more updates than Fuji, yes, guys, Fuji has killed the Kaizen updates. They released on their, what was it, the Canon R6 recently, where you can record to both memory cards. It was a huge update. They should have never held back, but they did. They pushed it out and gave it to their R6 owners, which was awesome to see. Fuji, I start seeing this earlier than other people with my X-T2, because when you record, and there's one of my ramblings, when you record video on the X-T2, it puts it in all these small files. And when I came from my Sony A6300, which I'll touch upon that again in a minute, it had these recording, like if I hit the record in 4K, it would take one video file. As long as you didn't get too long with it, but it would take one video file. With the X-T2, it breaks it up into little small fragments depending on file size. And you could have like, I don't know, 10, 15 clips for one short, like 30-second video, which is crazy. Well, they updated this with the X-T3 and with some other updates with the X-T3. Now, some of those X-T3 updates could not be done on the X-T2 because it doesn't have the same processor. Some things needed the higher processing power, but that did not. And they never pushed another update to the Fuji X-T2 again. This camera wasn't that old at the time. When the X-T3 came out, they pretty much wrote off the X-T2. It was sad to see. Then I knew Kaizen was dead. Now we see it more. I forgot I was going to do my little fancy lines. We've seen it. That was the first time, but we're seeing it more and more with these other cameras, especially the Fujifilm X-T30. This release was just a joke. They didn't even cover it on their big press release. That camera could have just been an X-T30 Kaizen update. Unfortunately, Fuji's going a different direction. Number 3 on my 10 Dark Truths. Number 3 is, seems like Fuji is the primary focus is on GFX. And I think this is good for the company. I think it's awesome for people that love shooting medium format. A lot of good things coming out. But for us APS-C shooters, I think it does take away their focus and their attention. They throw us a bone once in a while, and quite honestly, the bones they've been throwing, like the 23 millimeter and the 33 millimeter f1.4, not too exciting for me. I mean, part of the reason I like Fujifilm is the way they look. And although optically, and I haven't gotten my hands on one, I don't have anybody sending me stuff to review, but from what I could see, optically, they're stellar. I haven't seen or heard anything about video autofocusing, but the looks, if you guys compare, I've done a video on this. If you look at the Fujifilm cameras, this is one of the reasons I love Fujifilms. The form, the function. The new ones are just kind of sterile. They look like the Sonys. There's nothing wrong with the Sonys, and there's nothing wrong with the new lens, but that's not the reason I shoot Fujifilm. So the GFX has taken a lot of attention. You see 1 or 2 bones, like I said, but no breakthroughs in Kaizen, no breakthroughs in crazy lens design with video autofocusing and things like that. Just don't see it, and I think GFX is a big reason why. Number 4, they're not that much smaller and lighter than full frame cameras. You see people all the time say, oh, the reason I switched to Fujifilm X-T whatever is because I was sick of dragging a huge DSLR full frame camera, and I'm done with full frame cameras. But you guys, and I never had a full frame camera. I've always shot APS-C cameras. But one of the reasons I didn't want a full frame camera is because I didn't want the weight and the size, but I was uneducated. I still like Fujifilm, but if Fujifilm made a full frame camera, I would buy it. And the reason being, there's multiple reasons, but size and weight should not be one of them. People look at like this camera right here, XT2. It's got the 16mm f1.4 on it, and you'd think, okay, wow, an f1.4 lens. Look how small it is for an f1.4 lens. But yeah, it's not really. Let's take a better like-for-like example. I'm going to show you guys. I'm going to set this down for a second. 56mm f1.2. Love this lens. Short, fat 56mm f1.2. You think 1.2, wow, that's crazy. f1.2. Did you see the f1.2s for Canon? It's like huge. Yeah, no, it's not comparison to that lens because this is a smaller sensor. If you do the math on the Fuji, it's like 1.5 or 1.51. I forget what it is. If you do the math, this lens is like for like. Let's take Sony. Let's compare Sony because I do have an example here to show you. Like for like is an 85mm 1.8, which is a great portrait lens. But let's take a look at the size comparison. I did something for you here. Go into my pictures. And let's take a look for this lens, right? Okay, that's the price. That's another one. We'll get to that in a minute. So let me go here. That's the camera. Here we go. And I'll show this on bigger screen. So let's look at the specs. So I pulled up the Fujifilm 56mm f1.2R, which is this lens, and compared it to the Sony FE 85mm 1.8. It's a full frame lens. And this lens is a great lens. People that shoot it optically, great. They say it's on par with the Zeiss, and great lens. Well, neither one of them, I think, have image stabilization. Let's look at it. Now, this is a 9 elements, right? And we got 7 blades. So 7 blades to 9 blades on the Sony. And what that does is gives you a little bit better bokeh. Sometimes the more blades, the way it goes around, it will give you a little bit more rounded bokeh. So the Sony kind of could win out. I'm not going to do optically comparisons between the Sony and the 56mm 1.2. I know the Sony will focus faster. It is a newer lens design. So let's take a look at the dimensions. So the Sony is a little bit bigger, right? So you got 2.88 by 2.74. The Sony's 3.07. Very, very, very similar. We're talking fractions of an inch in size. But let's take a look at the weight. 405 grams for the Fujifilm. 371 grams for a full frame 85-1.8. So equivalent lens to lens, the Sony full frame is lighter. So, that's the lens, guys. That's the lens. So let's take a look at the camera. So the camera bodies must be smaller because everybody says the camera bodies, right? APS-C, smaller sensor, smaller camera bodies. Let's take a look at another like-for-like comparison. Now, of course, there's cameras that are bigger in size, but you can buy an APS-C size camera that's bigger in size than the X-T4. And let's take a look at the X-T4 specs. This is the Sony A7, what do I have? The A7C, which is their compact camera, full frame, to the Fujifilm X-T4, right? So let's take a look at the dimensions. So the Fujifilm 5.3 by 3.65 by 251. And let's look at the Sony full frame camera, 4.9, 2.8, 2.4. It's smaller in every dimension than the APS-C X-T4, right? Let's look at the weight. The weight, 1.16. The weight of the Sony full frame camera is 1.1, or 509 grams compared to 526 grams body only comparison to the X-T4. So even the body is heavier and bigger on an APS-C than the Sony. So you might think the APS-C has a bigger battery. It's got IPIS. Yeah. No. The A7C by Sony has a bigger battery. They got the Z battery, the 2280 comparison to the 22. So very similar size and battery. They're like for like. They both have IBIS and body stabilization. They're very, very, very close in performance. One is a full frame. One is an APS-C. So like for like, if you compare camera to camera, it's going to be about the same size. This is where I'm going. You're not going to save any weight. You're not going to save any size like for like. If you're going from a Sony or a Fujifilm, you can do the same thing, same performance, but with the Sony, you have a difference in a full frame sensor. It comes down, again, for me, that full frame sensor. So if Fujifilm had the same camera and this 56 millimeter was an 85-1.8 in the same size, no doubt any Fujifilm owner, you're lying if you're saying would not upgrade to the full frame Fujifilm like for like. Same size body, same size lens. The only difference is an 85-1.8. And when you get a full frame sensor, you're lying if you say that you would not prefer that. So now you might not want to because you have all this APS-C glass and you have to sell it and buy new. But I think the true people would know they'd rather have the full frame size for size than the APS-C, because why wouldn't you want those advantages? And we're going to talk about that. So I wanted to show you guys the size myth. It's a myth. It's from people that are coming from these huge DSLRs and they upgrade or switch to a Fujifilm camera that is smaller. But you can get full frame mirrorless cameras that are smaller. Usually it's just Sony, and Canons tend to be a little bit bigger for the most part, the good ones anyway. So not much smaller and lighter. So I think I've proven that. It's not, my opinion. I showed you facts. And this is coming from a guy that loves Fujifilm. And I like APS-C. I don't think it's a bad thing. But let's talk about it a little bit more in a minute. Extreme bokeh not easily achieved given the sensor size. So, that guy talks about in that article about, if you need bokeh, just get the 50 millimeter 1.0. Yeah, if you want crazy bokeh, as I mentioned in my earlier comment, full frame is the way to go. You can get, in Canon, they get f1.2s, but Sony's all day long, you can get the f1.4 lens. And the f1.4 lens, there's a pretty big difference between, again, we're talking full frame, 1.8, which is equivalent to this lens that I just talked about with this 1.2 on Fuji. So if you're going from a 1.8 full frame to a 1.4, it's going to grow substantially, just like the 50 millimeter 1.0 grew substantially. It's going to give you that bokeh. You're going to have more range. And then really the f1.4 isn't the pinnacle of full frame. 1.2 is, and Fuji has nothing to match it. If you're shooting Canon with the f1.2, that is a bokeh monster. So if you're looking for crazy bokeh, the f1.2 on full frame is the answer. I think it's overdone. This Fujifilm, hell, the 35 millimeter f2.0, this has got enough bokeh for me. I love this lens. It's a great small lens. So I'm not a bokeh hound. I think it's overdone. But if that's your thing, full frame is the answer. So cross that one out. Number 6, not a great value compared to Sony or Canon. Full frame and APS-C. Now, a lot of people say, oh, you can buy, people that I respect and follow their videos, you can buy 2 lenses of Fujifilm for the price of this, and they'll pick a high-end Canon lens or a high-end Sony lens, like a G Master, something like that. And Fujifilm's lenses, they're fantastic. They're built good. The optical quality is fantastic. But let's get real. It's still an APS-C lens. Again, I talked about the equivalent of the 1.2 to the 1.8. Canon couldn't sell, Sony couldn't sell an f1.8 lens for as much as Fujifilm does. So we talked about the weight and size. I took some other screenshots. Let's take a look at, let's check out, just for example, like for like, when we talk about full frame value, right? And we're going to talk about APS-C value, but let's talk about full frame value. Let's look at these 2 cameras side by side. We have on the left the Fujifilm X-T4, again, $16.99. On the right, we got the A7C. Now this is a full frame camera. We just compared the lens and the size, only $100 more, all right? Now this camera on the right will probably start getting discounted because the Sony is like 3 years old. And this is the A7C, but this one's more, I think, like 2 years old, because this is basically a condensed A7 III. A7 III will be discounted. I'm almost 100%. Once the A7 IV comes out, I think they're going to cut that a few $100s and bring the other one a few $100s more. And it'll actually be cheaper than the X-T4 APS-C. Let's take a look at the lenses. That lens I compared about that 85mm 1.8 to the Fujifilm 56 1.2. That Sony lens, not on sale, neither one of these are on sale, is $598, $600, compared to the less performance, although it looks a lot cooler, and that's the reason I would pick it, the Fujifilm 56mm at $1,000. So $1,000 compared to $600. Optically, they're both fantastic. The F rating, given the comparison, is on par, 1-to-1. So tell me if Fujifilm is still a value? No. What they do is they say, oh, look, this is a $1,000 lens. It's a 1.2. And then they'll compare it to a G Master 1.4 of, $1,400. It's like, come on, guys. It's not the same lens. Stop trying to confuse people. So value, that's for full frame comparison value. So what's going on long and get a drink of coffee. That's full frame comparison. Now let's take a look at the APS-C comparison. Now, I think I did a video or a snapshot on this. Maybe I didn't. Oh, I didn't do a snapshot. I do have it up on here. Oh, I don't. So let's do this together. I thought I had it open, but I must have closed it. Let's look at the difference. Sony, I had it in my cart. Sony, Sigma 1.4. All right. So I'll leave this one up. So this is the 56mm f1.2, but let's switch this to the Fuji 23mm 1.4. Okay, let's take the new lens, right? 23mm f1.4, Sony or Fujifilm, sorry. And this is APS-C, like for like. When I say like for like, focal length. Now Sigma, I'm not saying they're as high quality as Fujifilm. I'm not even having that discussion. I love Fuji, and if Sigma had, here's how I'm going to state it. Money dollar for dollar, I'd probably buy the Sigma over the Fuji, but I wouldn't sell my Fuji to buy a Sigma. Does that make sense? So I'm really happy with my Fuji. Build quality and all that stuff is great, optical quality, but dollars coming out of my pocket, there's no way I would spend that much more for a Fujifilm lens than I would for a Sigma lens. So if we look at an A7, or I'm sorry, if we look at a Sony A60 300 something, I don't even know what the latest camera is, and you looking at lenses, and big time is lenses. And this can also hold true for Canon. In Canon, it's more of the DSL line. I mean, I had some awesome wide angles, like 10 to 18 lenses that were cheap as dirt, $100, $200, awesome lenses. Canon, unfortunately, on the mirrorless line, they just don't have many options. But Sony does. Sony's got their options, but really it's their third party for the APS-C. And Sigma has these lenses. They're contemporary lenses. You can get them way, way, way cheaper than you can for Fujifilm. So if you're getting into an APS-C format camera, I would think hard. I mean, these Sony lenses didn't exist when I moved from Sony to Fujifilm. If they did, to be honest with you, I don't know if I would have switched. One of the reasons I switched and left Sony, there was two reasons. One is the damn camera overheated in photography. They did push some firmware updates after 3 months after I sold it. The second was glass. The lenses just weren't there. Fuji had all this great APS-C lenses and Sony didn't. So I left. That's the two reasons I left. But if they had these contemporary 1.4s, for this price, I probably wouldn't have left. And you can actually get a 3-pack and you're done, man. You could get, let me see if I can find it here. It's like $1,000. Here it is right here. $1,000, $1,117. You can get 3 lenses, all their contemporary 1.6s or 1.4s. The 56 1.4, yes, this is a 1.2, but it's more than enough, the 1.4. 30 millimeter and the 16 millimeter. So this is the 16 millimeter, the one I just took off. It would be comparison of this. This lens is $1,000. This lens is $1,000. Or the 16 might be $899 now, I don't know. And then what do you get? The 23 is $900. So you can get 3 lenses and a nice case for a fraction of the money. So what would we be up to? Almost $3,000. So let's say, $2,800 or $1,100. All right, value. IBIS. Now, this camera, the XT2, does not have IBIS and body stabilization. I was so stoked when the XS came out, XS10. And I bought it. I didn't pre-order it. I waited a little bit. Again, that virus kind of didn't know where we were going to be with money. So I did end up buying that camera, and I didn't buy it just to do a video and return the thing. I bought it because I was going to keep it. It had IBIS. I wanted IBIS. I've been wanting IBIS in a small, lighter camera. And the reason I wanted it was for video. I got it, and it was horrible for video. It did great for photography. And that was the other reason I wanted it. But for video, it was horrible. What I wanted it for is to take this little thing here, this 35 millimeter f2, do some photography with it, click it over to video and hit the button, and then, because this is not an image stabilized lens, and you get that crazy micro jitters. I wanted to be able to flip over and do video on vacation, and it was just this wonky craziness. That combined with the horrible video autofocus, which is my next item, it was unusable. And then the form and function wasn't like what I was used to and what I loved about Fujifilm. And I didn't have that same experience, so I returned it. So not getting into that XS, I did a video on that. So IBIS, yeah. Sony IBIS isn't great, but it doesn't give you wonkiness. Canon IBIS is just crazy good. If you look at the R6, I mean, it's just, people are walking around with that thing doing handheld video, and it's just fantastic. And it's a full frame camera. So hopefully the XT5 or the XH2 will have improved IBIS. So For photography, it's good. Video, not so great. Autofocus is horrible in the video. The only lens that I can use that gets decent autofocus is this. They call it the kit lens, but this is like a really high-end kit lens. It's just because they sell it in the kit. I wouldn't consider this a kit lens. The 18 to 55, what is it, 2.8 to f4. That one actually has decent autofocus. Not awesome. I've had $100 Canon lenses on a DSLR shooting their autofocus. It's fantastic. The 1855, it loses it once in a while. For the most part, I'd say 80% of the time it's doing what I want, but it's that other 20% of the time that you're doing a video and like, oh, that footage is ruined. Canon's always nailed it with video autofocus. The other thing that Fuji does that is horrible outside of the lenses, because it does vary depending on the lens, and that's normal from camera manufacturers, but Fuji's got like okay ones to horrible ones. Nothing is great. I haven't seen anyone yet that is great. Even people that love Fuji and shoot Fuji, most of them aren't recording themselves unless they're doing one spot and they're putting in a manual focus. So autofocus isn't great. The other thing that you can do in the camera, so if you're in a Sony and you're in a Canon, I think even Nikon works this way. You put it in continuous and you just run, right? And the video just does its thing. Fuji, they say, oh no, you have to go into this complicated menu and set your tracking and set this and set that, and it can improve. So if you're doing sports and someone's going to run at you, you got to go in and change and configure the settings to get optimal performance. That's BS. Come on, Fuji. Everybody else, you hit the button and you go. Video autofocus is horrific. Now, the X-T2 isn't a crazy great camera. This is 4 years old in photography, but the newer ones have improved. The XS10 was much improved in photography. So no concerns in photography, but video, would not be my camera recommendation unless you're shooting on auto or manual for focus. ISO and dynamic range, not great. Now this comes to the sensor size. For me, APS-C is good enough and I'm happy and I enjoy Fuji and I'm a happy camper. But if you try to compare it to a full frame, it's just not in the same league. When Fuji came out with the X-T3, they had a new sensor and I was excited. And then I seen the pictures side by side of the back-sided illuminated sensor, this new sensor, and the image quality and the high dynamic range and low light was the same as the X-T2. In some cases, X-T2 is a little bit better depending on, what software you're using, but it was not improved and it's not bad. It's not great. And the other thing I've noticed is if you underexpose in the camera with ISO and you take a picture and say you should have been, you screwed up and it's 2 stops lower than you should have had in camera. If you try to move that up in Lightroom or your other editing software, it gets very weird. Your dynamic range, you lose data even when shooting RAW. Most cameras, it doesn't really matter if you're bringing up your exposure in your camera software or your camera or your picture editing software. It's about the same. I didn't have that experience with Fuji. I've missed a couple shots and try to bring them up even in RAW, and it's just not as good as nailing your exposure in the camera. And like I said, the dynamic range, just not on par. It's not. So is it good enough? And I had someone recently say, hey, they were looking to do it more professionally. What I recommend people is, sure, people are doing it professionally. There's some really good photographers that are just killing it with Fujifilm. And it comes down to, is it good enough? Yes. Can it be done? Yes. Can it be done at a high level? Yes. Would a full frame do better? Yes. It would. It would give you a stop, if not 2 stops. I'd say about 1.5 stop high dynamic range improvement and low light improvements. Do you need it? Wedding photographers, I'd say you'd want any stops that you can gain. Again, do you need it? Is your customers going to notice it? Probably not. For me, if I was shooting here and there and it wasn't, putting food on my table, I would have no problem shooting. I probably wouldn't use the XT2 because of the autofocus. XT3, XT4s all day long, I wouldn't have any reservation about doing it professionally. Now, when I say professionally, part-time, if I was shooting full-time, I probably wouldn't. I probably would have a Sony or a Canon for a couple reasons. One is that. The other is they're more set up for ergonomics. If I'm sitting there, shooting triggers all day with my finger, I'd want more of a trigger style finger. I'm not going to get into it too much here, but I probably wouldn't shoot this at a high level, meaning my full-time camera. If I was getting into photography, I was quitting my job and I was shooting full-time, it would be a full-frame camera, either a Canon or a Sony. But I love my Fuji, and I still wouldn't sell it. I'd keep my Fuji gear. So what does that tell you guys? Lightroom. So this is my pros and cons in the X-Trans sensor. I love the X-Trans sensor. I like how I mentioned how it gives me that sharpness because there's no low-pass filter. I also like how I think the colors look, how they pop until I do my blind study. But one of the huge drawbacks of an X-Trans is it doesn't play well with Lightroom. Now, there is software that does fantastic. Capture One is one of them. I bought Capture One. I've tried to get used to it, and I just maybe haven't put enough effort into it. I don't like Lightroom, or I don't like Capture One as much as Lightroom. I'm having to learn everything all over again, which not a fan of. But if you're in Lightroom and you try to sharpen, or even at a lower level, you get these wormy, weird artifacts because of the X-Trans sensor that you don't get using Capture One. Now, a lot of people like myself, you have the Adobe suite anyway, so I'm having to buy 2 sets of software, and people say, oh, that's no problem, or oh, I like Capture One better anyway. Yeah, they were forced to switch. Most people would prefer just to stay with Lightroom. So that's one of my only complaint. My only complaint about the X-Trans is Lightroom. It'd be awesome just to be able to use Lightroom Mobile, and I've seen bad results with Lightroom Mobile as well. It really makes my life a little bit more difficult. And of all of the problems that I mentioned here, were there dark truths, I rate it that number 10 for a reason, because it's my biggest negative is, if you want to call it a workflow, even though I don't shoot professionally, is when I'm on vacation and I'd love to use Lightroom Mobile and have everything just sync and be able to edit my raw pictures. It's just like, ooh, that went bad fast. So I don't. I just use out-of-camera JPEGs, and I'll talk about my workflow in another video. I won't get into it, but that is my biggest complaint. So, I guess that shows you how small these things are on their own. But I did want to share with you guys my top 10 things. If you're thinking about getting into Fujifilm, it's great. And I want to end this on a high note. It's great. I mean, the form and the function, I just love how you use it, how you're engaged with the camera. I love the lenses, at least the older lenses. I like the camera system. I don't plan on getting rid of it. It's not perfect. I'm sure no camera system is perfect, but there are a lot of downsides, most not significant, but I just wanted to make you aware of them. If you're thinking about getting this camera versus another camera, if you're getting APS-C instead of full frame, I wanted to put things in perspective for you. And I hope I don't get bashed by my Fuji followers, but I'm just trying to keep it real for you guys and the maybe new people. I will be doing some other camera videos too, not just Fuji, even though Fuji's got a spot in my shelf for sure, and it ain't going anywhere. Just wanted to keep it real, and thanks guys for watching. Have a good one. Take care. Bye.